This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Steve Englehart worked in the Advanced Games Group of Atari, where he developed ideas for new computer games. He was the designer of E.T. Phone Home, Final Legacy, and Garfield for the Atari 8-bit computers, and worked on several unfinished games. He wrote the manual for Eastern Front 1941. This interview took place on November 17, 2017.
Well, I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I graduated in '69, which was still Vietnam War time, so I had to go into the Army. When I got out of the Army, I went to New York and started doing comic books and did comics for about 5 years in the early mid '70s. Decided not to continue with comics at that point. I didn't realize that I would come back to it later. So I eventually ended up writing a novel for Dell Publishing, just a thriller novel. And they liked it, and they gave me a contract to do a second novel, and I thought I would set it in the then 1981 hot concept of Silicon Valley, which was south of where I live here in Oakland. So I called up a friend of mine, Ted Richards. Have you interviewed Ted Richards?
I believe I've talked to him, yes.
Okay. So Ted was working at Atari, and I said, I got questions about how things work in the computer business. And he said, screw that, come work for us. And I said, no, I've got a contract to write a novel. And he said, but we'll give you a computer. The Atari computer, of course.
Sure.
So I gave the money back to Dell and went down and started working for Atari in 1982. I started out as a documentation person, but pretty quickly they put me in the Advanced Games Group as a, idea guy. I mean, I to this day I can program in BASIC, and that's about as far as I can go on the programming side of things. But they brought me in to come up with ideas for the games and stuff. So now we're at Atari. There you go.
Nice. All right, so tell me about the Advanced Games Group. I mean, how did that work? They literally just like give us 10 ideas for games, or were they like, we need a game about a monkey? I mean, how did that work?
Yeah, that was, well, as I'm sure you know, the original programmers for Atari had asked for more money and had gotten fired for their trouble.
Yeah.
The second group of people had asked for more money and gotten fired for their trouble. So by this time, there was no third group of people. They had, they'd pretty much run out of people who wanted to work for Atari. So they went and sort of beat the bushes. The guy in charge was named Chris Horseman. You probably talked to him. He was British and had worked with somebody in England that I'm blanking. This is all a very long time ago for me, right? I mean, my career was comics, so most of the questions that I've talked about over the last 30 years have been answering comic stuff. I don't remember, haven't been asked too much about Atari. Thorny M.I., I think is what I want to say, is where he had come from.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it was a sort of eclectic group of people, and we were sort of supposed to come up, we were supposed to be the third group, or the best equivalent they could get for people to come up with games. So we created concepts and then took them to fruition. And when I say we did that, I can say, my contribution was ideas and characterization and so forth. All the heavy lifting, all the programming, all that stuff was done by other people, right?
Sure.
So
nice. So were there? Coming up with ideas is one thing. Implementing them on the computer is another. So were there
right.
times where you were just like, oh, I think that we should have Garfield do this and this, and they were just like, wait, we can't do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, there were. Because I didn't know the parameters of what video game. I mean, coming in, I didn't. I learned stuff over time. But yeah, I would, I would come at it from a comic book standpoint where you can sort of do anything. And I wasn't stupid, so I mean, I knew you couldn't do anything, and so I, tried to. I'd say, "What about this?" And people would go, "Well, we can do this, but we can't do that." And I would go, "Okay, well, fine." And then as we went forward, um, things were continually being refined. I mean, I think our biggest claim to fame is we did the ET computer game, not to be confused with the one in the desert.
Right.
Um, because we always have to explain that there were two games, right? And we did the ET game. And so, we came up with a picaresque game where Elliot, whatever that kid's name was, would wander around with his Reese's Pieces and he would do this and that. And so in that case, we were trying to get as much of a story in it as possible. But, I mean, we were dealing with machines that had 64K of memory, right? So, I mean, the implementation was always um, a story that I'll toss out that I do remember when Dragon's Lair came out. Um, Chris Horseman took the entire group over to an arcade in Sarasota, I think, with a bunch of quarters, and we just played that game for like the afternoon. And I looked at all that, the full animation stuff, and thought, that's obviously the future here. And we then went back to Atari where I guess either we didn't take all the group or else maybe the guy just fired up when we got there. But there was somebody there, as I recall, when we came back, and he was saying, "Look, I got us a dragon," and it was a little pixelated, 8x8 dragon.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, um, but I sort of have to keep emphasizing I was kind of it was programming heavy, and I was not a programmer, so I was, I hung with everybody and worked with everybody, but my stories are more on the side of the main thrust, I guess.
Hmm. Well, it's important though. I mean, without the decent ideas, then the programmers don't have much to do, and these were bigger projects than a little one-person 2600 game. So
Yeah, well, I mean, Atari, I started at Atari in 1982. They were bankrupt. I remember I had like six. I started in the summer of '82, went to a Christmas party in '82, and it was right after that they started like, really hemorrhaging money. Um, so, I take some credit for killing them, but uh, we started out with the idea and had many things sort of in progress with the idea that we were going to be leading the great Atari renovation. But then when the money started to run short, things kept sort of getting truncated and put to the side and so on and so forth. Um, so the ideas were big to start with. They got, as implemented, they got smaller. But I mean, I worked on Eastern Front and wrote a manual that got an award and so forth. I mean, things were still interesting and useful, I guess, from my with what I was contributing to the whole thing, but the ability to implement these things shrank over time. And that was not the fault of anybody other than the people who ran Atari, who drove it into the ground. But everybody I worked with, I mean, we were trying to do, the next era of games, um, and in the end, um, almost nothing came out. I mean, Final Legacy. I think a very truncated version of Final Legacy actually made it out, but it was a much more elaborate game when conceived.
I didn't know that you wrote the Eastern Front manual. Did you work with Chris Crawford extensively
Yeah,
on that?
Chris and I were good. Yeah, we were good friends. And I mean, I knew him sort of from the start. I mean, and I mean, it was obvious that he wanted a really good manual for this, and here I was, the guy who'd written stuff. So um, we put together that manual, but that game I think was pretty much entirely Chris's. I mean, I don't recall contributing to it, and I don't recall anybody else actually contributing to it. I think it was pretty much Chris, but he wanted a really nice package for the whole thing, and so we did that. And as I say, the art directors of Northern California or somebody gave us an award for the way the manual came out. Um, but yeah, Chris, I was up at his home a number of times up in the hills, and um, we were we were good buddies, um, as long as I was at Atari, and then even afterwards for a while. But
Mhm.
since I didn't pursue the video game or computer end of things, I haven't talked to him in a long time now.
Sure. Do you recall writing or working on any other manuals when you were in the documentation group?
Um, I'm gonna look at my computer where I have a list of things that I did. Well, there was one called Camelot 3000, based on a comic book. Um, Again, I don't necessarily remember how far any of these things actually got, but I know we had meetings and started working up a game for Camelot 3000. Um, Garfield,
Mm-hmm.
we worked on that. Spook, we worked on that. Those were more conceptual. I don't think Spook ever got very
I
far.
haven't heard of that one.
Yeah, it was. What do I know about it? I'll look on my own website and see. Um, but you can go, you know, on. I will say this for everybody. You can go on steveenglehart.com. That's one word, but an E twice in the middle. Um, and under games, I've got what I remember about everything that I did. Um, so I could read it to you, what
No,
it says.
I'm looking at the list. It's a nice little list. Now you were at Atari from
80,
'82 to 2005.
no, no, no. 82 to 84.
Uh huh.
Um, when they sold it to Jack Tramiel,
Uh huh.
he laid off nearly everybody, including us.
Right.
Life went on. And then in 2005, Atari Labs got in touch with
Oh,
me.
I
And,
see.
and Atari Labs, you know what Atari Labs was?
No.
Atari Labs was an R&D thing. It was owned, I don't even remember, you would know better than I, who owned it in 2005, but I think it was some people in LA, as I
A
recall.
completely different company that, yeah,
Oh,
it had
yeah.
been sold multiple times by then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they they set up an R&D office in San Francisco. Again, really good people. Um, I started working there, and 6 weeks later, they pulled the plug on
Mm.
it. So, um, but it was kind of like trying to do cutting edge stuff that would be the future of Atari 3 years down the line. I worked up a game, or worked on a game. Well, in my case, since it didn't get very far, it's mostly worked up a thing called Tribe. We were going to try to do a thing. This is jumping way out of sequence, but you can edit it or whatever. Um, at Atari Labs in 2005, we were trying to set up a thing where all the Atari games, all the characters in the Atari games would be connected. Um, some people would be in more than one game, or you'd have a character and you'd mention that his brother liked to race cars, and then that would be the brother racing the cars. And I built this whole world where all these people and possibility, like what kind of games are we going to do? How would I build a world in which people were related or knew each other or so forth? Would have been extremely cool, I think. And then, as I say, 6 weeks in, that was the end of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had two, and in fact, I had three shots at Atari. because in the year 2000, I worked for a website called Games.com, which was owned by Hasbro. And Hasbro had the rights to the Atari games at that point. And so Games.com, which is like the greatest web address ever, um, was going to be all the Hasbro games to be played on the computer. And that included, that they owned from Atari. Um, that got bought by a French guy who does a lot of video game stuff in France, and I don't remember that name either. Um, and he bought the company. He bought he bought Games.com from Hasbro. Came over from France, walked into the room, and the first thing he said was, "I do not believe in the internet." He just wanted the names, the copyright names, and the ability to develop them as computer games, I guess, whatever, but not on the internet. So that company went under. I mean, my experience with games is pretty much always getting laid off after a certain amount of time. And not just me, the entire company.
Right.
I apparently have, although I can say Atari, I seem to have picked, entities that didn't last very long. And then actually I can make it 4 because in 2004, the French guy had sold the rights to that to a guy in Cincinnati. And I got an email one day saying, now I own the Atari right, the name to Atari. And you worked at Games.com, and I'd like you to come to Cincinnati and work, for me. And I thought, well, this is bizarre, and I don't really want to go to Cincinnati, but, what the heck. And the first thing my wife did was Google the name of this guy who had gotten in contact with me, and the first thing that came up was a wanted poster because he had allegedly handed somebody in Texas a check for $100,000 that bounced the year before.
Jeez.
So I said, but I went to Cincinnati and talked with him, and I'm not going to mention his name, and you could track it all down if you wanted to, but he talked a really good game, but it turned out that he basically had no money. He just was, he talked a really good game, and he had bought the rights to Atari, but I think that even reverted because he didn't pay them. And I worked in Cincinnati for a month and actually got to like the town of Cincinnati. But after a month, he sent me back to California, and pretty soon thereafter, he was bankrupt too. So it's only the people who are going out of business who want to hire me in video games. But yeah, so I've had 4 different in interactions with Atari.
With various companies calling themselves Atari. Sure.
Exactly.
I'd like to dive a little deeper on the 2 Atari 8-bit games that I know you worked on, both E.T. and Garfield. Here we have well-known existing properties that you needed to adapt into games. So how did you go about that? Did you have to collaborate with Spielberg or Jim Davis for ideas, or how did that process work?
No, the ET thing, they just gave us complete précis of the movie, and I mean, I can't remember if we probably had seen the movie. I guess the movie had come out by that time, must have been. But we were just working off of Bibles and so forth, and I mean, obviously, I guess we had seen the movie, and so we knew what the story
The
was.
game came out quite a bit after the movie, so you probably saw
there
it.
you go.
Yes.
So yeah, so we were trying to replicate that story in a video game fashion. I mean, there were things about following your little Reese's Pieces around, I remember, and you would go to different places and have different adventures within it. That was all just working, just us sitting around a table discussing what was in the movie and what we could do with it. The Garfield thing, Jim Davis did come out, and I and the rest of us met him at that point. But other than sort of giving us his blessing, he was not involved with it thereafter. It was just supposed to be a Garfield level game. I mean, it was fun, and it was not all that deep or anything, but it was just supposed to be fun. I know with the Camelot 3000 game, which I guess never really went too far, but the guy who wrote the comic that was based on, Mike Barr, came out, and because I do know him because of the comics, he came out, and that was sort of odd because we knew each other as comic book guys, and now I'm sitting on the other side of the table from him as an Atari guy, talking to him about how I'm going to adapt his game. But we didn't have. I'm trying to remember, but I don't really remember. Other than Jim Davis, I don't remember anybody ever coming to visit us or to give us input. We all just worked off of the materials supplied.
Nice. And you also worked on Final Legacy, I believe.
Yeah, Final Legacy was this very, it's kind of like this show that's out now, The Last Ship or something like that. I mean, it was like there'd been this huge war, and this was like the last ship, and it was supposed to go around and do things. And then the released version, I think, maybe had one or possibly two of the things in it. It just, that one was really like well underway and going toward an end, but not near enough to the end to do anything other than to sort of take the modules that worked and stick them together and call it a game and get it out the door. Just at the end of the '84, at the end of the Warner Brothers end of Atari. Just Jack Tramiel had his own ideas about what he was going to do with his company, and it didn't really include what we were doing.
Sure. And I'm looking at the Spook screenshot for the first time. That looks fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was going to be an arcade game, and whatever it says on that page, I don't remember much about it. I'm reading it myself, and in fact, we did the programmer whose name it says I forget, and I still forget. And I apologize to him. Nice guy. We went over to the Winchester Mystery House, which is a thing in San Jose for people who don't know. It was the widow. She was the widow of the guy who invented the Winchester rifle, and she became convinced that the Indians were going to come and kill her if she ever, the Indians who got killed with his rifles, were going to come and kill her if she ever stopped working on her house. And so this house just, it has stairways that go up to the ceiling and stop. It has room, it's a very interesting thing to visit. And so we went over there to look at it, to give us ideas about spooks, and haunted houses and so forth. But other than sort of mocking up a screen, I'm not sure that we ever, I don't recall it ever getting really.
So, what haven't we talked about the Atari days that we should have?
I mean, the other thing that might be interesting is that Chris Horseman and I, after Atari went under, worked up a game called All Hallows Eve. Um, and I wrote a very complete Bible for that storyline and proposed gameplay and so forth. And Chris, who had gone back to England, I guess in '85, whatever, um, was going to handle the production of it. We were going to do it. It was going to be a CD game. We were going to have a game in 1985 that would be on. Can that be right? It must have been. I mean, it was a CD game. It was going to have the ability to have some animation and things would change depending on what you did and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But and I remember being in England, going to England, for whatever reason, probably 86, 87, something in there, and went to a recording studio where he was putting together, his end of it, but nothing ever came of it. I don't know whether it was too advanced. I think think that was the problem, if I recall, that it was like we could put all this on a CD, but there weren't enough CD players out there to really do anything with it. Um, now, of course, it would be extremely old technology, so I'm not sure why we never, or it's pretty much in his ballpark. I'm not sure. Um, you have talked to Chris Horseman, I would assume, at some
I don't think I've talked to Chris.
All right. Well, when you talk to him,
Yeah.
good. You can ask him whatever happened to that. Um, yeah. I mean, so we formed, at least conceptually, a company called Magic Logic, and this was going to do this game, but it just, I think we were both too ambitious for the audience, or
Yeah.
for the ability of the audience to actually play what we had in mind. Um, but it was going to have, on my page here, I see I've got All Hallows Eve and Hobgoblin. It changed its name from time to time, but you were going to have a little amanuensis, a hobgoblin who was going to walk around with you and give you shit, and and help you out, and but I mean, there was a story to it. It was like it was taking place on Halloween, and you had to bring, I think, standing stones from 4 directions to Stonehenge, and and there were goblins, obviously, and witches and all this kind of stuff. Real elaborate and interesting game, I thought. But tell Chris to kick it into gear when you talk.
Thanks.
He's only 30 years late. Um, uh, anyway, yeah,
Thanks.
no, I just, again, I was there. I can say 4 times that I worked for Atari. Um, but I'm really, I'm on the periphery of all this stuff.
Sure.
Primarily because I could only go in so far. I could take my ideas and hand them off to somebody, but I couldn't, you know, do anything with them after that. So whatever happened after that is not much that I know much about.
Sure. Tell me briefly about what you do today.
Well, today I'm retired. I went back to comics. I swore when I left comics that I was done with them. I'd done some stuff I was real happy with, and I thought, why keep doing that? But in 1984, I went down to the San Diego Comic Book Convention, and both Marvel and DC came up to me and said, "Hey, you want to do some comics again?" And I said, "No, no, no. I'm working for Atari." And I went home, and that Sunday night, Chris Horseman called me up and he said, "I think we're all going to get fired on Wednesday because Jack Tremill's about to buy the company." So on Monday, I called up Marvel and DC and I said, "Hey, actually, I've had second thoughts about this." So I went back to comics at that point. Did comics through most of the 80s, got out in the late 80s, went and wrote children's books for Avon because I had children by then. I did freelance stuff. I worked for Activision for a while. That wasn't freelance, that was on staff, but I did that. Um, Worked on Bard's Tale for EA, worked on Spider-Man for Sega. I mean, was able to keep doing this, but again, always, from the peripheral side. Went back into comics again in the 90s for a while, then got in. You asked the question. One of the comics I did in the 90s got turned into a TV show, so I worked on the TV show for a while. Did a few more comics in the early 2000s, and then left comics and wrote some more books. And by that time, I said, "Okay, now I can retire." So I did.
Cool. So, how do you spend your time now that you're retired?
Well, I still write. I mean, I like writing. That was always the thing. And I'm actually writing a comic book sort of series of graphic novels, which is just for my interest. I mean, I like the storyline. I'm seeing where it's going. When I get done with it, it's probably going to be commercial enough that I can sell it, but I don't have anybody lined up. I'm just, and throughout all this, I mean, basically what I liked to do was write. I like to conceptualize stuff and put it down on paper, and then either somebody would draw it, or somebody would program it, or somebody would go film it, or or whatever. Always the execution part fell to somebody else. But I just like to write, and so I retired, and then I found that when you retire as a writer, nobody hands you a gold watch and says, "Fine, now you can go play golf." You still write. So that's what I do.
Yeah. Good. I think I have what I need. Thank you, Steve.
Well, you're welcome. I hope so.